All right, well, it's 3 o'clock, so let's begin. Very glad to see everyone here on this afternoon of day 3 of sPark. We are here for a panel on environmental justice, and I'm very grateful to our 3 speakers who will teach us about that subject today. In keeping with our tradition here in sPark, I'm going to give very brief introductions and invite you to refer to the virtual program to learn more in-depth background about our speakers. But they are Kelly Cox from the class of 2013. Kelly Cox Esquire joined Miami Waterkeeper in September 2016 as staff attorney and program director. Today, she is the general counsel and chief operating officer for Miami Waterkeeper. We have Shannon Dolan from the class of 2022. Shannon is a junior park scholar majoring in environmental sciences and minoring in marine science, applied ecology, and technical and scientific communication. And then we have Jacob Rutz from the class of 2014. Jacob is a lecturer at Elon University, specializing in agroecology and environmental science. And here to moderate the panel today is Andrew Dadone from the class of 2022. Hey, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that quick introduction. I'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to our panel on environmental justice. I would really like to have some contribution from the chat and everybody out there. So we want your questions as well, but I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with one of our questions, and then I'll start looking at the chat for anything else that you guys have to say. So COVID-19 has continued to reveal massive inequities in our food system. How have communities responded, from local to international? And have these helped us work towards a better world, or just reinforced the unjust establishment?
Greetings, everyone. I just want to let you know my hair looks crazy because I'm in pure COVID fashion. I had to stop inside at a Starbucks where I can't sit indoors yet. I really apologize. I'll repeat myself as necessary. Panelists, since I can see your faces, is it super blustery in this moment, or is it okay?
It's blustery, Jacob. It's harder to hear you now.
Okay. I'll let somebody take it while the wind stops, and then I'll butt in later. Once it calms down a bit, I apologize. I'll try to find a better spot if I can.
I can jump in for you, Jacob. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. My name is Kelly Cox. I'm the general counsel with Miami Waterkeeper. We're a local nonprofit, and we work in South Florida, and that's actually where I'm located. I live down in the Florida Keys, and I work in Miami, and we really focus our work on environmental conservation efforts, particularly with respect to marine resources, water quality, and sea level rise and climate resiliency. So while I can't speak to this food disparity piece, what I can do is tell you a little bit about what environmental justice is and what we'll be discussing today. So environmental justice is the inequitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens in society. And this is a movement that actually developed in Warren County, North Carolina, back in the 1980s, when a primarily community of color came to learn that they were going to have a toxic waste landfill implemented in their community, largely without their consent. And for the very first time in the 1980s, this community stood up against this toxic waste disposal facility, and they rallied and they protested in the streets and they pushed back, and eventually were able to have some degree of success in relocating the landfill. But that was not an isolated incident. Environmental justice largely is a trend of these types of incidences occurring all across the United States. So toxic waste disposal sites, food deserts, industrial sites that are polluting the air quality or the water quality, more often than not, are located in primarily communities of color. And so what we're going to be discussing today is some of those disparities and some of those solutions. And as you can tell by the composition of this panel, maybe we have a little bit more work to do in representation and diversity, but that's what we're here to talk about, is how we can make a more equitable society in terms of environmental impacts. So I don't know, Jacob, if you're back and able to chat about the food piece. I don't work in food policy. I work primarily in water policy, but I can talk about drinking water, that's for sure.
I'm gonna try to make a quick jump, y'all. If my camera goes off, I might switch a different device real quick. I'll be right back. I again apologize for the inconvenience of it.
So following along with what you said, Kelly, about inequalities and such in the diversity within the sector, I'll jump to this question. Can you speak to some of the ways you've seen the problem of environmental injustice being combated through changing who is doing the science? What are some programs you've been a part of that are focused on improving representation in the conservation field, which is historically a white male profession? Along with that, how can we change research to mitigate the impact of bias?
Okay, I can start off with this one. And so in addition to being a park scholar, I'm also a Doris Duke Conservation Scholar. That's a program that has a cohort at NC State. And the mission of the program is to increase diversity within the conservation field from the side of like who is doing the research. And so I have been fortunate to be able to go on a Conservation Leadership Week during my first summer as a part of this program, where I met with current leaders in the conservation field. We talked about how to increase, representation of who is doing the science. And this is really important because, as much as us scientists want to say that our research is and the work that we do is completely unbiased, there are, our own perspectives that come into our research. And so creating really diverse groups of who are creating the questions and who is deciding where research money is going to, and also, deciding what type of, or who in the community are we talking to make sure that the questions that we're asking are applicable to the community is really important. And so part of my experience has been trying to increase that, and a way to alleviate some of the biases that I kind of talked about a couple of moments ago, is to kind of create a different setting in academia. I think right now in academia, we focus a lot on, being weighted and evaluated on how many papers you can produce and how much grant money you can get. And so it's a lot of individualistic, you want to rush to get something published because you get the notoriety and you're the first person who is publishing whatever, as opposed to working with someone else who might be an expert at a different university and collaborating. And so I think maybe changing how we evaluate scientists and how we consider academia and research, and making it a more collaborative environment. So instead of I want to be the first author on this paper and it's really important, instead combining funds and kind of creating collaborative things where people come together and they address a bunch of different problems, instead of two people doing very similar research projects and then not collaborating and then being able to address bigger problems. So I think that is an important aspect.
I think too, I don't work in the science space and scientific research per se, but I was listening to this interesting podcast the other day, and it was saying that up until 1993, in the public health space, in the way that we're designing clinical trials, we actually design clinical trials in this country based off of primarily white males. And when you translate that across, when you're thinking about that from a vaccination standpoint in the COVID world that we're living in, that becomes pretty significant, because it means, women or people who identify as women are not getting the representation they might need in these clinical trials, and that extends to the environmental space as well. So in environmental law, we do a lot of work in risk assessment and exposure limits for toxic chemicals or pollutants and things like that. And so when we're not contemplating the full breadth of and diversity of the population in the way that we're designing experiments and engaging in scientific research, that can have very serious ramifications for who is being inequitably treated and experiencing different and more adverse effects than other populations. But I thought that was really interesting. As early as 1993, we were not diversifying clinical trials to even incorporate women, let alone the diverse population that we have in this country.
Hey, how am I sounding now, y'all? I'm in a vehicle now that has a sweet young baby that is in and out of sleep. So if you hear some squawks, again, we are in this COVID pandemic, crazy travel time. So apologies, but it's better than windiness. So I was going to add that when thinking, about research and representation too, I like Shannon's points, are excellent, and I wanted to add on to the idea about the subjects, the people who are traditionally, the people being researched, and oftentimes, especially in the food system research, we don't work as collaboratively with the people who are, considered the subjects. And so having research methodologies that are based in sort of maybe a justice lens, or a lens that is asks, people what they need versus the assumption of need. We see this a lot coming out of the Latin American tradition, with a lot of different forms of research that do say, like, there's a type of work I've been doing a little bit here in North Carolina that's called like a sort of a farmer-led breeding project, where you work collaboratively with farmers to identify plant traits that are necessary for a broad base of environmental conditions and adapting to climate change, or regional tastes and attributes. And when we are able to engage, in a broad way, asking the broader base of small and mid-sized farmers who are more likely to be farmers of color, especially when we think about it in an international context, we open up the folks who maybe contribute to science, not just as like the explicit researchers, but the people building the scientific base of knowledge.
Thank you. Now that we can hear you clearly and you're in a better place, Jacob, I'll give you a question here. Food production, from cattle ranching to rice production, is often blamed as some of the greatest emitters of greenhouse gases. How can agricultural endeavors become not just carbon neutral, but, as some describe, regenerative, and draw down carbon in ways that work to empower communities and the underserved?
Thanks, Andrew. And I definitely I would love to also think about this broadly with my co-panelists about, I guess, the broader context of climate change and the environmental justice movement, and where our different interests lie. I would say, right now, when it comes specifically to the food system, there's, as Andrew said, there's a lot of excitement about opportunities to not just minimize greenhouse gas emissions through the food system, but actively draw it down. Projects, or things like Project Drawdown, and documentaries that talk about these different forms of cattle ranching or sea farming and things like that, advocate for environmental change through these technologies. And to me, my understanding of the science from both experience and participation in it is that we're beginning to understand how to do these things, but the lack of access to resources for farmers and farmers of color and farm workers in relationship to the drive to mitigate climate change, I guess it hasn't really changed anything. I'll be kind of dipping my toes into the legal side of things, and maybe Kelly knows more about the Pigford case with the USDA, how as early as just the turn of the 21st century, the USDA had a very massive lawsuit fought against them by farmers of color who over the past 100 years and more had been discriminated against getting access to loan money and access to finance and credit, and really just terrible treatment by the federal government, who has basically redistributed this country initially from native peoples and through the end of slavery and lots of the transfer of power or transfer of farmland across white folks to black folks during some amounts of during redistribution, and then eventually back into white farmers' hands. the USDA has unfortunately had a very large part in that. So I'm getting a little long-winded with it, but I think what I'm trying to say is that we have to understand the social context in the food system so that the opportunities and benefits allotted to those of us who are involved in climate change mitigation can be equitably distributed, and starting with the broad understanding of the historical context of that inequity in the food system is that first step.
I can also speak to some climate justice concerns. Climate justice and climate gentrification is something that we're experiencing in South Florida pretty rapidly. We've had 9 inches of sea level rise in the past 100 years in South Florida. And so traditionally the high value properties along the coast are now getting flooded more regularly. And so people are migrating toward the interior, which is where the primarily Black and communities of color exist along the coastal ridge in South Florida. And so we're starting to see sort of a resurgence and a mobilization of wealthy, affluent white people, and even in Miami, Latinx people coming in and buying up these higher elevation properties and driving out those communities. And that's creating a real issue of climate gentrification that we're grappling with. Along those same lines, we're also struggling with the first cases of climate refugees. So in this country, I'm sure many of you have heard this case in Louisiana, where the indigenous community was essentially ousted from their ancestral lands because of flooding, persistent flooding, making it absolutely unlivable in that space. And so this begs like a sort of interesting legal question as to how are we handling tribal sovereignty? How are we handling climate migration? How are we handling climate refugees, and making sure that those burdens that these indigenous communities and communities of color are experiencing, which by the way, they are disproportionately contributing to the greenhouse gas problem at such a low rate. How are we making sure that these folks are taken care of and that they are given the resources that they need in order to be able to combat this, both climate gentrification and actual threats to their land and their homes from climate change. So it's a really evolving area of law that I think that we'll be encountering a lot over the next few decades, especially here in South Florida.
Thank you. So for more of a general question for all of you, is there an example of something that you've heard of recently in environmental justice that would be considered a success story and kind of show where things are heading in the future, what you would like to see?
I can share a success story we had recently, but in order for there to be a success story, there has to be a real harm to a community that didn't deserve to have the harm imposed upon them. So down in Miami, we have an area of Miami called Coconut Grove. I don't know if anybody's been to Miami, but the western part of Coconut Grove is a primarily Black community and Caribbean community. It has been since South Florida and Miami became a city. And that area is also one of those elevated areas I was just mentioning that's on the coastal ridge away from the shoreline. And that community over time had developments in industry built up in the community, including a trash incinerator that was widely called Old Smoky. And Old Smoky, the trash incinerator, produced a bunch of ash basically from the trash that was being burned at the incinerator. And now we don't incinerate our trash. We know better. We understand the environmental harms of this. But back then in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, this was a very common practice. And so that ash from the trash incinerator was distributed on public parks and even any sort of public right-of-way, and even inadvertently disposed of by way of the smokestack. With time, there started to develop a sort of cancer cluster in this area, in this primarily Black community. And so researchers from the University of Miami started to take notice and do some investigations. They did environmental assessments, they pulled soil samples, they evaluated that there were really high levels of arsenic and other toxic chemicals and things that are typically found in incinerator ash in people's backyards, in public parks and facilities. And this was a really big problem. And together through a coalition of historically Black churches in Miami, the University of Miami Environmental Justice Clinic initiated a lawsuit against the city of Miami for knowingly being aware of the incinerator ash that was on public parks, but refusing to do any sort of restorative work in order to reclaim the properties and reduce the threat to this primarily Black community. So in sum, what ended up happening, they ended up being successful in this advocacy effort. They were able to get basically the public parks shut down in these areas until they were reclaimed and the soils were removed and treated and up to a level that was safe for the public to engage in the properties again. So a success story in terms of this community mobilizing and being able to respond and oppose, the toxic contamination that was on the site, but really not much of a success story because it's a relic of institutional racism that the incinerator was built in the primarily Black community and wasn't built in affluent white Coral Gables next door, even though the trash from Coral Gables was going to the Old Smoky incinerator. So really, ultimately it's a good outcome, but it shouldn't have to get to the point where people are getting sick from exposure, and the law clinic has to step in order to serve as an advocate. So just in one small example.
I have one that is a little bit closer to home. So Duke Energy and Dominion, and home being North Carolina. So Duke Energy and Dominion was projected to create a pipeline, the North Atlantic pipeline from West Virginia to North Carolina, and it was going to go through disproportionately Indigenous people's land. And they ended up canceling the projects in June because it became too expensive. But when you look into it more, a bunch of grassroots and like nonprofit organizations within the communities kind of rallied and were advocating against creating this pipeline, and because of it going through these areas, and kind of what Kelly was saying, that they would disproportionately affect people of color and Indigenous people, and that there are adverse health effects and ruining land when you put pipelines through. So that was kind of a win because it is canceled at the moment, and that it was not built. So these lands are still protected, or at least don't have a pipeline through it at the moment. And that Duke Energy has claimed that they're going to move more towards renewable energy and battery storage now. But yeah, kind of similar, that it's like a win, but not fully.
Yeah, I appreciate how you frame that, Kelly, around success is couched only in a historical inequality for which is either being recognized or remediated or attempted to be remediated, which, it's hard to feel like real reciprocity has happened because of the original injustice. The things that come to mind to me in the kind of agricultural world are also a couple that are ongoing, sort of farming projects. There's some really amazing small and mid-sized farmers who are doing work to recognize the sort of personal transformative power of agriculture and then reinstitute it in a way that is invigorating for the land. So two farms that come to mind, not super local, but are regional, I suppose. One is called Sylvan Aqua Farm, led by a Indigenous fella named Chris Newman. And another one is Soul Fire Farm, which might be a little bit more familiar to folks who are interested in the sort of food and food justice world. That's Leah Pinkman, I believe, and others. But both farms just do an amazing job of trying to help bring awareness to different forms of agriculture that are based in either a historical tradition around kind of African American methodologies, kind of basically, farming practices brought from Africa through the slave trade into the United States. And much of the agricultural knowledge in this country, initially came from African slaves. It wasn't necessarily the white Europeans who were massive landowners who understood how to grow food on a large scale, they had to bring in, African engineers essentially, on slave ships to grow food. A lot of the rice that's, so famous in parts of South Carolina was very much built and developed by African farmers who were, brought against their will to manage these farms. So Soul Fire Farm does a really cool job of, helping people see and understand that context and bring it back a little bit into the public space. And then Sylvan Aqua Farms is one that's inspired by Native people's practices and thinking about a larger scale regenerative agricultural system that integrates our historical ecologies. We don't think about the fact that like bison used to roam in North Carolina. We have Piedmont prairies, a prairie system, extended into our part of the country and of all the way, through into the Midwest and, Dakotas and such. So their vision is to try to bring back some of these native foodways and more importantly, ecological systems, and how that can be done through, confederations of businesses that are multifaceted and cooperatively owned. So they're trying to look at the business and the agricultural and the cultural sides kind of all in one fell swoop. And so I'm really inspired by some of Chris Newman's writings. He publishes a lot on Medium, which I know isn't a peer-reviewed source, but really interesting writings about and thinking about how the food system could be transformed for the better.
Great. So we do have a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to go through now. The first one is, for environmental destruction and deforestation, such as the cutting down of the Amazon rainforest, many of the people who cut down the forest have less money and need the land in order to support their families. How can a balance be struck between protecting these vulnerable areas while also assisting families who need the land to survive?
I mean, I think this is like the inherent question of international development, right? So you want to build capacity in the communities, and that requires education and awareness of long-term impact versus short-term gain. So I think that it's very challenging. I don't value, or I don't envy folks who are working in international development, because these processes sometimes take decades to actualize, and it takes a long time, and there's a lot of environmental impact in the interim. So I would say, I saw a few questions in here about how do you balance, or how is the economy at odds with the environment? And I just sort of reject that principle as a notion. I don't think that they're at odds with one another. I think that they have to work in tandem together, in order to be protective of natural resources and to ensure sustainable yields for many generations to come. So I think that in terms of this example with deforestation, it's not only an education piece, but it is largely a sense of capacity building and empowerment as well.
And so Kelly, you touched on this a little bit as we're going through that question, but another question in the chat was, are capitalism and environmentalism compatible? Likewise, is a sustainable food system possible in a capitalist economy? How does regenerative ag rectify co-opting indigenous knowledge and repackaging it as something new?
Hey, Greg, that's a great question. Thanks for posing it. And it's nice to hear. I don't see you, but I'd love to talk to you sometime about this even more. Just to jump into it, the same question was posed at a talk I got to go to a couple of years ago by Malik Yakini. He is the head of, I'm going to screw up the name, but it's like the Detroit Black Farmers Cooperative. He's a really cool, kind of mid-sized farmer who's trying to take back some of the emptied spaces, the sort of, unfortunately, the spaces that have just, been opened due to the loss of industry and so forth in parts of Detroit, and turn them into places that are empowering for people of color that are still in Detroit. And when he was asked this question, because they're trying to start a cooperative, I believe, grocery store and food service system that needed a couple $1 million to get started. And then, they were looking to venture capital or typical bank loans. It kind of felt like a both and, that you have to use the tools of the oppressor to also work towards fighting for the oppressed, and the hope being that money can be slowly, it's not a zero-sum game or anything, but money and energy can be worked towards sort of a new economy, I guess. I do have a hard time reconciling some of the base principles of my understanding of our economy, and how, there seems to be an ineffable aim towards stratification of wealth. And when I think about how regenerative agriculture can rectify some of our financial inequalities, I think about how there is, in agriculture, the more you invest in the in supporting the biology, oftentimes that means the more you are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and you are, in theory, helping address climate change. And you're also ultimately improving the food system or you're improving the yield. It's almost a rule across most agricultural systems that if you can increase the organic matter, you can increase the carbon in the soil, you will produce more food over the long term. But over the short term, you might have a reduction in yield, or getting there might take extra energy, money, and time, and potentially loss. And so we suddenly have to extend the length of our scope of what counts as economics, or what counts as success, because suddenly the time scale of the reward, the time scale of the income is extended over a much longer period of time. And so when I think about how we can modify the economy through the food system, in particular, in other forms of tackling inequality in the environment, I think that if we can widen our time scale and understanding of what widen our time scale so that we can embrace technologies that focus on climate change, or greenhouse gas drawdown, and other sort of biologically based systems. Sorry if that was a little bit of ramble there at the end, but hopefully it was something useful in there.
I'll also chime in on this insofar as regulation. So I think that one of the ways that we instill sort of checks and balances on environmental protections is through regulation and through the law. And a really great way to ensure that we can have capitalism and it not be at the expense of the environment is through environmental regulation and the passing of environmental laws. And an interesting fact that I'll share with you all is that we actually don't have a nationwide law on environmental justice. It's something that advocates in Congress have been moving forward with, but to date, there's nothing on the books. We have an executive order from President Bill Clinton, but that's about it. And if you know anything about executive orders, you know the rules are made up and the points don't matter. It can be very easily overturned by subsequent administrations. I think, in order to redistribute wealth in a way that's really meaningful, we need to be talking about a nationwide law that provides for blanket provisions for redistribution of wealth when we're thinking about environmental injustices and things. I know we're talking about now very beginning rumblings of reparations and things like that, but maybe that's something that a nationwide environmental justice act could implement. So a lot of these cases that we're talking about are actually not brought under environmental laws. They're brought under the Civil Rights Act. And occasionally there are environmental justice actions that do use environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act, for example, to achieve environmentally just ends. But I think that speaks to a gaping wide issue here in this country, that we don't have a mechanism in place legally to allow for redistribution and restructuring of the economy after environmental injustices take place.
Kelly, am I correct in, as our resident legal expert, that there is no nationwide carbon like credit system, no, sort of made into law credit system like other nations like Germany or others have, that sort of monetizes a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions that could in theory help some of the restorative ecological projects that a lot of indigenous communities do kind of get more teeth and finance behind them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's nothing nationwide. I think that California has some sort of monetization system in place, and maybe some other states, but yeah, nothing sweeping.
Yeah, to kind of add on and onto what Kelly and Jacob have said, and also take it a little bit differently too, in terms of like fisheries and sustainability. Kelly kind of hit on what I was going to talk about with like policy, and that fisheries policy is kind of what enables fishing to be on the more sustainable side, and that people can fish and make a living off of it. It can be a capitalistic type of economy fishing wise, but then the policies and like catch limits and stuff like that enables it to be more sustainable too. So like increasing some of the policy aspects of that is really important. And similarly, like the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Acts really ensures that like we can have sustainable fisheries, but people can also make a living off of fishing.
Two of you started to answer this question at the end of your statements, but we do have one in the chat for what do you think the role, if any, that the emerging carbon economy and carbon credits might play in moving towards environmental justice?
I think, for one, even the threat of a carbon credit being implemented makes it so that any coal power plant, at least in the United States, is very unlikely to be built in the future because it's just no longer economically feasible. It's probably going to be too expensive when you're factoring in this carbon credit. So the fact that we even have the threat of that coming up is really important in considering, again, like where would these coal plants, if they were to be built, where would they be placed? And so if we're not building those, and we're not maybe putting them in places that are predominantly people of color or other minorities or other areas that could face health impacts by a coal plant being generated or put there. Also, carbon credits or carbon tax will, depending on how the electricity market is run in that state, because the electricity market is run differently in every state. Some have deregulated and some have like monopolies. And so depending on what state you live in, the carbon credits could be like passed, or tax could be passed on to the electricity user. And so if like carbon taxes are implemented so that the tax that you get from it are then passed on to us, the consumers, and so it's like a net zero in change in price for us, the consumers, and it might be worth it. But a tax could potentially raise the price of electricity in communities and areas where they're still using electricity from the grid, and maybe they don't have the money to put solar panels on their house, and so they're still relying on the grid and they need electricity, but now it's more expensive because they have a carbon tax on it. And so we have to like really consider and think about how we're going to use this tax money and make sure that like it's still equitable and that people can get access to electricity, because we are continuing to move towards everybody needing, equitable and fair and equal access to electricity.
I think Shannon hits on such a great point and not to speak on your behalf, but in a lot of ways, I just feel like we're not there yet with carbon credits. Flint, Michigan, and the people of Flint, Michigan to this day do not have clean drinking water to drink out of the tap. Like, we are talking about basic human needs and resources that are not being met. And so until I think that we can establish that those needs are, in the hierarchy of needs at the top, and they need to be taken care of immediately, I don't even know that this country is going to have a dialogue about carbon credits. I mean, even where I'm working in Miami, we're facing this issue. Just a few years ago, we had a primarily Black community in Opelika in South Florida that had a sewage main break happen. And the municipality was almost bankrupt and didn't have the means to fix the sewage main break. And all the surrounding communities sort of just sat back and watched this raw sewage spew into the streets of this primarily Black community. And these kids in the community are walking to their bus stop through raw sewage and have lesions on their body from exposure to toxic chemicals found in sewage. So until we can handle basic human needs like that and implement a rapid response to take care of our people, you know, I just don't know that the rhetoric in this country is going to advance with the carbon credit. I mean, if we can't even advance with respecting people's rights to live and to subsist in their community, it's just seems like a very big stretch to me to be contemplating carbon credits.
Yeah, I really appreciate what y'all are both saying about that. And it's, you know, it definitely strikes me as, you know, what is wrong with our economic system when we can, this is gonna get very political really quickly, but, you know, we can spend so much money towards certain interests around maybe militaristic or other types of subsidies. You know, the fossil fuel industry has received historically, I think the number is like $330 billion worth of subsidies over the past, you know, 80 to 90 years. And, you know, we can't invest, in basic health and human infrastructure that gets rid of lead in pipes or you know, you know, ensures that everyone has enough to eat on a daily basis. You know, we don't believe food is a right in this country, even though most, you know, developed and many, you know, not developed, quote unquote, developed nations believe that is an ineffable human right. The one thing that I think about though with the idea of carbon credits, that's, you know, I would hope it'd be a both and conversation, that it's not as if we can't get to it, but definitely agree full-heartedly, you know, the house is burning, you know, we should get the people out first and then consider the structure, so to speak. But is this the fact that, you know, greenhouse gases have a residence time in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, depending on which ones you're looking at, you know, methane in particular, you know, over 30 years, I believe it's like, you know, 100 times the greenhouse gas potential of CO2. And then over 100 years, it goes down a little bit. But essentially, you know, the idea being that, you know, what we're putting in the atmosphere now is going to exist for 100+ years and, you know, affect our grandkids and their grandkids, and the amount of warming and devastation of, you know, natural systems that allow us to have the ability to clean water through natural wetlands, or the ability to just, you know, have the ecosystem services we depend on for just the basics of clean air and clean water, clean soil and so forth, are also at threat. And of course, you know, horrifically, you know, the communities, you know, most at risk are, of course, those that are people of color for the most part, and lower income communities. And so, you know, I would hope that, I don't know enough about carbon credits to be explicitly saying like yes, no, maybe so about them, but just that we do take long-term investment ideas into consideration when we think about environmental justice, because the long-term effects, of course, of greenhouse gas emissions won't just be stopped when we stop emitting. It will take hundreds, if not thousands of years to mitigate some of those impacts.
So it looks like we're running out of time. I want to make sure that everybody knows the next session. You'll be invited to join students in their park blocks. That'll be starting at 4. Eva, did you want to say something?
Yes, Andrew, thank you very much for doing a terrific job moderating. Thank you very much to all 3 of our panelists for your expertise on such a complex and important topic. And I am pleased to share a bit of park news with everyone here. We have just announced, like it just got posted to the web about 5 minutes ago, the recipient of the William C. Friday Award from our rising senior class, the class of 2022. And I thought I would tell you about it in brief because it's very relevant to this session. The recipient will be Julius Tillery. He is the founder of Black Cotton, which is a business that centers and uplifts the Black community closest to the cotton fields in Northampton County, North Carolina. And he is a leader in environmental, agricultural, and racial justice in our state. So he will be speaking next year at some point in some way to be determined. We really look forward to welcoming him to our campus so that all of us can continue this conversation about environmental justice. So you can read more in the link I shared in the chat. But thank you again to everyone for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at our next sPark session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being on this panel today.